Welcome everyone to this webinar, which is organised by the Centre for Autism and Theology. My name is Zoe Strong and I'm a PhD student at the University of Aberdeen, and I also do administrative work for the Centre as well as co-hosting the Autism and Theology podcast. I will introduce today's speaker in just a moment, but for now I have a few words by way of introduction for those who haven't joined us before. The Centre for Autism and Theology was launched in 2018 and is co-directed by Professor Grant McCaskill and Dr. Leon van Omen. We host interdisciplinary research into autism and other types of neurodivergence as they relate to theology, church, and faith. So the Centre acts as a hub that brings together all those interested in how neurodiversity and theology intersect. The aim is to contribute to academic discourse, but also to be of service to faith communities. If you want to find out more about the Centre, do take a look at the Centre for Autism and Theology website, where you can sign up to our mailing list and also find more details of how to get involved in what the Centre is doing. You can also follow us on social media. But today it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Krysia Waldock, who will be sharing on the topic, The Impossible Subjects, exploring autistic people's inclusion and belonging in religious groups. Dr. Krysia Waldock is an autistic and disabled researcher who has undertaken research on neurodivergent people in religious groups, including churches, for the last 8 years. Krysia is currently a postdoctoral research at Swansea University and is also a member of the Neurodiversity Task Group in the Church of England. You might also recognise Krysia's voice as one of the co-hosts on the Autism and Theology podcast. For the next 30 to 40 minutes, Krysia will present on their research. We will then have a short break during which you can type questions into the Q&A function on your screen. This part of the webinar will be recorded, so we will try not to read out the names of people asking questions. However, if you want to make doubly sure that you are not identified by name, look for the small checkbox which offers you the option to ask your question anonymously. As always, we ask that you can be succinct and please use the facility to questions rather than posting comments. Bear in mind that the questions will be moderated, so don't worry if you don't see your question immediately after you've typed it. We have a team in the background sorting and ordering the questions. We often don't get through all of the questions, so if you see a question on the list of published questions that you think, oh, I really hope they get to that one, you can vote it by clicking the thumbs up sign and it'll help us to prioritise what we get through. You should also be able to turn on closed captions via the language and speech settings. If you're having any issues with this, please send us a message into the Q&A and we'll try our best to help you. The final thing to say is that after the webinar, you're welcome to get in touch with any questions and our speaker may be able to reply to you. But for now, I will hand over to Krysia, who will share her presentation with us.
Thank you, Zoe. I will now try and share my screen. Can you all see my screen? I have got some thumbs up, which is great. Thank you so much for the warm welcome this, I was going to say morning, afternoon. Shows how long I've been up at work. My name is Krysia Waldock. I am lots of different things, as Zoe said, and I'm here to talk to you today about some work I did for about 6 years when I was doing my PhD at the University of Kent. And I think it's really useful for me to sum up where I'm coming from first. And this is a quote from a paper I wrote for the Canadian Journal of Theology, Mental Health and Disability some years ago now. And this very much is kind of why I did the research I did. And it's about my experience at church. I wasn't gently placed on the margins. I questioned and struggled being placed there. So as Zoe so aptly has introduced me, I'm a neurodivergent and disabled academic and researcher. I've researched neurodivergent and disabled people in religions and religious groups for the last 8 years, roundabouts, in lots of different ways and on different projects. I'm currently working at Swansea University, but I'm also very much involved with the Centre for Autism and Theology, particularly with the podcast that they do. So I'm sure some of you will recognise my voice and the estuary accent I have, kind of indicating from what part of the UK I might be coming from. And I'm also part of the Neurodiversity Working Group in the Church of England, which is always great fun to have a chat about all things disability and religion with loads of other cool people. Today I'm going to be talking about the story that came from the research I did. This is very much grounded in what the people who took part said, and also some work that I did in terms of doing an autoethnographies where I wrote out my story and looked at theoretical links and looked at kind of zoomed backwards and forwards in regards to how I made sense of things and some theoretical stuff and how I made sense of those strands all together. I also want to share some ways sideways, which is further thinking I've done since I did the research in the last year, particularly in some of the conversations I've had with some other decolonial and disability researchers and theological scholars. There obviously are going to be quotes from participants on the screen. It's not their real names, it's either pseudonyms, kind of fake names I picked for them, or sometimes they picked themselves because they didn't like the name that they chose, and actually they chose a name that better represented what kind of who they felt they were. And this is just almost a round and round showing you what I'm going to talk about and some of the time scales in which I completed it. And as you can see, I completed a lot of this during the COVID lockdowns and just afterwards. So that's also really shaped some of people's experiences that they have shared. And I guess a really good place to start would be kind of why bother? And I guess from the audience I have here today, there's going to be a lot of people here that will get why this work is important, why we should be exploring autistic people's lived experiences within religious groups. In my research, I focused on churches and mosques in particular. But within autism research more generally, CAT is one of the exceptions to the rule. It is not really a thing that's really done all the time. And it's really important that we do listen to autistic people's experiences and kind of unpick them a bit more, because it's part of the social world we live in. We're all part of what goes on in general society, and we kind of all bounce around together. And churches and mosques and other religious groups can be part of autistic people's social worlds. Past research has indicated that actually religion can be really important for disabled and neurodivergent people. I've got a small list of citations there. Very happy to send any references afterwards. I haven't given a full reference list because otherwise we'd be here clicking all day long. That gives you a flavour of the kinds of different things, and this is just a drop in the ocean. There's so much more I could have added. And from my own personal experience of actually having attended churches for many years, I'm Christian. Actually, I've known a lot of people who are autistic within church spaces, whether they know they're autistic or not, and with a variety of different support needs and profiles and understandings of what it means to be autistic. And I guess when we think about belonging, it is a universal human need. When we look at different bodies of academic literature, there is a lot of people, and again, this is just a drop in the ocean with some of the references, that actually people keep saying how important it is. And this is very much echoed within Maslow's hierarchy, its triangle. Belonging is the third from the bottom. And my colleague Precious, in her PhD, argued that religious groups have been conduits to inclusion, so kind of relationships and also places where people feel that they can belong. You know, they're really important and significant for many, many people. But there's also other experiences that have been picked up, both in kind of people's lives and academic literature, actually indicate that this isn't the case for everybody, although some people might experience this. There are sometimes barriers to belonging for some people, and religious groups can have what we call strong in-group dynamics. So very much, this is the way we do it, this is how we've always done it, and can be for some groups of people who perhaps don't fit kind of standards, for some perceived standards, might not be perceived as being a part of that group. And then when we think about autistic people more broadly, actually, autistic people seem to face barriers in gaining a sense of belonging in actually many different settings and contexts. It's not just a religion thing. Autistic people have been argued to have what we could call an othered identity. So people can face bullying, struggle with maintaining friendships because of the way they're treated, or kind of a mutual breakdown between two people, isolation. Being autistic is kind of been written about as stigmatized. I mean, I'm sure you're very aware of what's going on in the States at the moment with JFK and the autism register, prime example in point, with the negative stereotypes for autistic people of all support needs and all communication styles. And many autistic people are also seen as not credible, so we're not necessarily seen as people who can tell our own stories. And I guess it's really important here for me to say that although I'm autistic, I've not been perceived as credible in many ways, even though you're probably sitting there clocking going, but hang on, Krysia has a PhD. There's been many, many different times that people haven't believed me purely on the basis of being autistic. And this came through from the group conversations I had with autistic people, and also in the stories I collected of autistic people who had attended or currently attend churches and mosques. Louise said that she'd been bullied in lots of different contexts, many different places, Sunday school, youth clubs, primary school, secondary school, even on a certain type of youth programme that's supposed to be about bringing people together. Ian, who was another one of my autistic participants, said we need a better way to have people understanding the multifaceted nature of the spectrum. Too many popular thought is autism as the dysfunctional ones, the savants, and there's no one else and no one in between. So there's this real kind of binary understanding that's been picked up by some of my participants. Yumus was one of the people I spoke to about his experience having previously attended a mosque, and he reiterated what Louise said around constantly towards the end. Every little thing I'd say or do would constantly be brought back up again or picked up. And Fred took part in some of the group conversations I had with Christians and Muslims on their understanding of inclusion and belonging. And Fred said, unfortunately, there's still people out there who will make it difficult and hard, almost impossible, and will take, bearing in mind where they are, perhaps what they believe, their beliefs, won't make it an easy ride for someone who comes into this sort of scenario. So it shows the kind of real potholey environment that's been picked up by all of the people that I spoke to throughout the various group conversations and the stories I collected. And this also was reflected in my story to an extent as well. I sat in the Wetherspoons at Margate on the seafront in, say, March 2023. Dr. Erin Rafferty and Dr. Michael Paul Cartledge approached me and went, do you want to write a paper about kind of congregations and kind of belonging? We've got a special issue. And I went, yes, because I'm a sucker for saying yes to everything. And when I kind of sat down and thought about what I can give and how I unpacked my story, I realised at that point how much actually some of my story overlapped and intertwined with those of my participants. And this particularly came up towards the end of primary school, where I increasingly felt not a part of the core group of children I'd grown up with in church. I'd gone to the same church since I was born, and I didn't know why. Sunday school was loud, it was busy, it was in a really big, echoey, cavernous hall. There wasn't someone for me to kind of buddy up with. And I felt really increasingly exposed. I felt awkward and out of place, not quite at ease, and I didn't know what to do or how to be part of conversations and get involved. And I guess this kind of, in a way, links to how we understand what it means to be autistic. And this is something I'm quite passionate about sharing with religious groups, particularly with churches. There's particularly a lot of people at the moment who are doing some fantastic work around this and who are really helping, because I think it's very much a village effort in how we deal with it, kind of how we educate and bring people together. But from my understanding, there's a lot of what it means to be autistic that's often defined and shaped by what I would call the neurotypical gaze. So it's basically outsider, neurotypical, non-autistic's understanding of what it means to be autistic, judged by people's behaviour rather than understanding people's lived experience and what's going on inside of them. And this very much came up in Yumas's story. He said he did feel like he was always being compared to his neurotypical brother, and I was always expected to be, maybe perhaps unconsciously or consciously, was always comparing myself to. There was a neurotypical standard, and this idea of a neurotypical standard ran through a lot of the how people compare people to other, or my autistic participants compared themselves to other people in their religious groups. And this isn't a surprise. There's been quite a bit of work around how religious groups can be particularly normative. CAT's co-director Leon Oman wrote about this in his book about autism and worship. It's a cracking book. Should read it. Highly recommend. And actually that religious groups can hold on to neuronormative norms tightly. So I guess when I mean normative, it's almost the desirable way to be. And this is often shaped by ideas of what it means to be not autistic, what it means to be non-disabled. And usually within churches, as we know, gender and sexuality are clear kind of boundaries of who might or should be included and excluded. And theologian Dr. Claire Williams uses a fantastic phrase called petitions of acceptability, and she argues that actually neurodivergence is one as well. And this does reign through a lot of the stories and conversations I had. Alia was one of the ladies who took part in one of my focus groups with Christians and Muslims, and she spoke about her autistic son and said in the end I had to withdraw him from attending the mosque because he didn't feel like he fitted in. He didn't feel like he belonged there. And this again intersected with something from my story where I spoke about a church I attended until I started my PhD, which was a different one to the one I grew up in. I said I sat outside. I felt physically excluded, unable to join in due to the noise and wearing big headphones. My autisticness with headphones being sat apart from everyone else. And in a way, this echoes into some really interesting models of practical theology that actually really interestingly show the almost a disjoint in kind of what we say we do and what we say we believe versus what we do and how we enact that. And I'm just going to click forward actually because they're slightly out of order. We have Helen Cameron and colleagues' 4 Voices of Theology. It's a really handy little tool. I love talking about it as much as I can. And there's 4 voices. I'm just going to give a quick recap for anybody who's perhaps not a practical theologian. Spouse theology is what we say we do, in very simple terms. Operant theology, how we embody it, what we do. Normative theology, what texts say, and formal theology, what the academies say, what professionals say. And if we kind of go back here, you can see that I've argued and that other people in the academic literature have argued what we do and how we act and embody faith, or what we do in any kind of organisation, institution, to blow it up even broader, is particularly normative. So we have very expectations that are set within non-disabled neurotypical expectations, which is really interesting. And it always reminds me there's almost like an ideal way to be. And I'd been reading work by Dr. Naomi Lawson-Jacobs and also Rebecca Spurrier's book as well. And Naomi has theorised a little bit around the ideal worshipper. And that tagline made me think, oh, that's really interesting. Because in a way, there's this ideal way to be and exist. Perhaps some people might disagree with this, but I guess almost from a theoretical perspective, I didn't meet the norms or that expectation. And this again was iterated in kind of people felt they matched this neurotypical standard. And this quote from Joan really exemplifies this. And never in all that period of time that she attended a particular church, I never felt good enough as a Christian because I could never be who they wanted me to be. And I think for me, almost what was coming through in the stories that I was collecting and the group conversations I had is people were saying one thing about how inclusion is really important and belonging is really important, but what people were saying and doing and was quite different. And a lot of people were reflecting on the humanness of actually how it's just really difficult sometimes to do what we want to do, but also sometimes attitudes and prejudgments from other parts of people's lives, so work or things they've picked up off the kind of different knowledge they've picked up from different places might also be shaping how people behave within their church or their mosque. And almost this causes this disjoint and boundary. And I wanted to share kind of some of the examples and quotes from some of the group conversations I had with Christians and Muslims, and particularly Fred spoke about New Testament being founded on love, love being unconditional. Judith spoke about a joint responsibility to make everyone comfortable and accepted. So again, these are just two snapshots. So lots of different things that people said. I don't think you can really encapsulate what each group said within 2 quotes. But if you compare it to some of the other things that people said, that actually they felt that churches sometimes could be a bit cliquey, or that people sometimes didn't understand autism and wanted to change someone's autistic distress and didn't understand it, we can see a real boundary and a real divide in those experiences. And this again made me think about Thomas Reynolds' cult of normalcy, where non-disabled and neurotypical kind of ways of being are presented as more valued. And this links to kind of this ideal way of being, this ideal worshipper. And this came up quite interestingly in one of the group conversations with Hayet. And what's particularly interesting, a lot of people I spoke to were actually more open-minded to begin with as well. I think it's really important I acknowledge that, and we're really open to being really reflective on their experiences. And she said, I'll be honest, if I saw someone covering their ears in the mosque, I think, God, what is wrong with this person? And almost that kind of seeing that what is wrong with them, that person's not valuable, that's very much a barrier to them being part of their church. And playing around with different kind of ideas that I found through the group conversations, through the stories I collected, this reminded me of people didn't quite know what to do with them, and it caused this kind of impossibility. And the term impossible subjects was first used by May Nye in 2004 in relation to Black African immigrants in the United States. And it was applied into religious studies work in relation particularly to LGBTQIA people as the main focus in Islam and in Christianity, both in 2009 and 2018. And there's when we focus on the different social dynamics that are in relation to different neurodivergencies, obviously autism is the focus here. Some of the same social dynamics can operate as in relation to gender and sexual orientation. They're not the same thing, but some of the same impacts and knock-on effects can happen, as Nick Walker and Dora Rainmaker argued in 2021. And then it made me think that actually it's because it's created by whoever's in the group. Maybe autistic people might be impossible subjects, ? And that's important within some religious groups. And it made me reflect on my story that I picked up on the autoethnography that I'd done. And it very much made me reflect on how, after a change of leadership in the church I attended, my stigmatized identity, me basically being out as autistic, caused further issues, particularly around things like advocating for my needs around sound. I have hyperacusis. I'm really sensitive to sound. I live right next to a train station. I can hear everything in Gravesend train station from 3 minutes up the road. Even from my parents' house, I could hear stuff from the crossing 10 minutes down the road, as an example. And when I kind of tried to say around a lot of the discomfort that I've been carrying, I was brushed off and marked out as a problem to be managed. And I became impossible. They didn't know what to do with me, and sat in this really weird grey area when I challenged the status quo around kind of social structure, but also who should be included and who should not be, because I was not the only person in the church I attended at the time who had this problem. I was the only one who had the guts to kind of say something. And what's again interesting is this wasn't just me, although it can sound like I'm talking about me a lot. That's the point of autoethnography. This was also reflected in the stories I collected of people who attended churches and mosques or currently attend churches and mosques. And when I thought around some of the theory, this idea around the impossible subject really kind of held it all together. And for me, this idea of me as an autistic person, there was a mismatch between me and what the ideal worshipper was. There was a mismatch between the two. And you could say they're almost two identity standards. So an identity standard is a really kind of sociological, symbolic interactionist thing, also used a bit in social psychology. Meanings of what it means to be a particular identity. So we all have lots of different identities. I'm not just autistic, I'm a swimmer, I play Pokemon Go. I also work with menopausal people on a project. I'm also a qualitative researcher. There's lots of different parts of my identity. I'm also a redhead as well, though the lights aren't really showing that very well. There's lots of different parts of me, really, really multifaceted. And each one has a point of reference of what it means to be that. So what it means to be a researcher, what it means to be a Pokemon Go player, what it means to be a swimmer, what it means to be an occasional bodyboarder, as I have on my Instagram. And there are some expectations attached to each of these identities. And each of these has a little feedback loop. And I guess my interest is on, I'm guessing you can see my screen, between the identity standard and the comparator. The rest of it's just a really nice feedback loop, and they all kick around really nicely and they do what they're supposed to do. But the mismatch of the point between the comparator and the identity standard leads to a lack of verification. So you're not doing a very good job at that. If you're doing a really good job at something, so if I was not autistic and I could sit in church and I could sing in tune and I didn't ask awkward questions, my my own kind of identity standard would be close to that of the comparator, and it would be verified, and I'd get increasing well-being. Stetson-Burke found that obviously there's a really good impact on identity verification. But where there's this gap, it can lead to minority stress. And minority stress is a community psychology, social psychology term for high levels of stress and prejudice faced by members of stigmatized groups. And kind of going back to this context, where you can have your my identity standards autistic and the group kind of a religious identity. And this is very much able-bodied, neurotypical, highly normative expectations built into this. We've got the normative operant theology. That happens. We don't get that verification, as I said. And I wanted to come back to Joan's quote particularly because it very much drives home the point of, in all that period of time, I was never good enough because I could never be who they wanted me to be. With this disjoint, you're not going to get that increase in well-being, that increase, those mental health benefits, the conduits to inclusion that quite a bit of the academic literature focuses on when perhaps you're looking at the benefits of being in a religious group. And this kind of gives one demonstration of why that might not happen. And this made Joan a situational impossible subject due to being unable to meet standards of the ideal worshipper. And there's emphasis there on situational, because I'm going to come back a bit later as to why I've really played with that, and also why I've been quite tentative in my title with the question mark as well, which was a really interesting conversation I had with one of my examiners in my Viva. And as I've said, we all have multiple identities. Everyone does. Autistic people do as well, of all different support needs, of all different communication styles. We all have multiple things that we do, we are. Therefore, we have loads of these feedback loops all kicking around all at the same time. And this can result with compounding intersectionality. So intersectionality looks at how different oppressions compound to shape people's experience in that way. And Sabrina, who attended one of my group conversations in 2020, really exemplifies this really well. Sabrina was a Black autistic person, and she said, I exist in multiple minoritized groups. I compartmentalize, can't say that word, compartmentalize my identity. So if I'm around Black people or Black autistic people, I play down the impact of being Muslim in these spaces. And if I'm around other Muslims, I play down the impact of my race in these spaces. And I'm constantly doing that, and it's really tiring. So as you can see, different identities hold different levels of importance in different contexts for Sabrina. Some identities are activated all the time, so things like your gender, disability or neurodivergence is another one, as I've kind of said below. Things that kind of are, think parent, carer, son, daughter, these are things that are very frequently activated. They shape our identities. And my work found that kind of being autistic was so frequently at the forefront, especially where people were so excluded from a lot of things, that it actually almost became this master thing. And I remember having a really interesting conversation, almost theologically, with other members of CAT a while ago when I presented an iteration of this. And actually, like, we should all, being in as Christians in Christ, that should be more important, really, really important. But people are feeling so excluded that other stuff is kicking up. And I guess that's what I find really, really interesting, is that there's this imbalance of other stuff is disrupting this feeling of belonging that people surely should have, that theologically we should have. And Ian said, then I got a diagnosis, started looking up what it meant, and I went, oh, 15 years of suffering, all makes sense now. And Roger said, I basically knew that I was different all the way through church. I knew I wasn't the same as everyone else. I wasn't the best at talking to people. So Roger had a very specific role that he had in his family's church. He was coffee person. That's what he did. That's what he was most comfortable doing. Everyone knew he wasn't the best at talking to everyone. And it was kind of a two-way knowledge that that was the case. I guess I now want to kind of play with, but actually what was the question mark about? Because when I first started playing with the idea, I thought, oh, this is actually quite a lot of people. But actually, I think it would be really reductionist, so kind of really narrow-minded of me to think that actually that everyone is an impossible subject. Are not all autistic people made impossible subjects? And it's again goes back to some of the identity feedback loops I was talking about. Thomas was one of my Muslim participants, and we had a really interesting conversation, had two really interesting conversations, really, really fascinating. I learned an awful lot from Thomas. Thomas moved to a certain part of a certain town on a certain road because he got for a new job. He was offered a choice of two locations, and he chose one particular town because of a particular mosque or masjid, as he said, within this town. He deliberately chose to live there because of his religious practice and religious beliefs. And for Thomas, being Muslim was his master identity. It shaped views on everything, including what it means to be autistic. And there's also these theological implications of the kind of term, because I know some people are already going, why are you using the word impossible? No one's impossible. That's not okay. And I agree. If someone called me an impossible subject, I'd be a bit annoyed. But there's a certain way why I'm using it. It's situationally created by other groups of people. You are made so that you don't fit in by other people's behaviour in that group. People are not inherently impossible. When we think of, particularly in Christianity, Imago Dei, so Genesis 1:24, Imago Dei includes all autistic people, as far as I'm concerned. And it echoes the neurodiversity paradigm, which values all body minds, so the ways that our brain and body interact together and kind of knock around together. It's not just looking at how our brains are different, but also how it impacts our bodies. Key example there is that many autistic people are hypermobile, like I am, and as is my dad. And whether the two would be knocking around quite so happily in our bodies is questionable if we weren't autistic. And this situationally created impossibilities is our doing, in my view. It's not necessarily always conscious, and I think I'm very aware, and this came through really strongly in a lot of the group conversations I had, that actually, people wanted to do better, they wanted to learn, but they're aware that it's just groups of people, and groups of people aren't always very good at doing what they mean to do, and almost that in itself accounts for some of the disjoint that might exist, which might then incidentally cause barriers to belonging. So within the kind of the work I did that I submitted last June, I gave some recommendations at the end, which some of one is in here, but I've done some more thinking since. And where I started kind of thinking forwards, because often we're out of research, we want to say what we can do better next time, how we can improve practice, how we can inform people, educate people. It made me think that some of the stuff that I would recommend is kind of already there. And I kind of wanted to share some of that with you today. Firstly, it's almost, and I guess this is a really big ask because I don't think anyone can do this all in one shot. But what became quite clear to me was that spaces that didn't centre non-disabled and neurotypical norms seemed to be more accepting of my autistic participants, but also my autistic participants felt more comfortable there. So Nicola spoke about kind of more broadly in society, despite the majority of people thinking they're inclusive and open-minded, as autistic people, we're actively excluded an awful lot, whether they mean to or not. And again, it's that recognition that people might be doing it without realising it, even if they have the best of intentions. And Ellie had a very different experience. Ellie attended lots of hippie music festivals, and she said that all differences were embraced and encouraged. When I'm there, I don't mask, it comes off. You're encouraged to lay on the floor and roll around. Instead of talking to someone, you can play cards with them or something. And that quote made me think, actually, is there ways that we can do church, not where we all roll around on the floor, because I would find that incredibly stressful and get stuck on the floor, but are there ways where we can encourage people to be who they are within a church or religious space, and where that is seen as a celebration and a contribution, a valid contribution to the church? This involves breaking down the idea that non-disabled and neurotypical body minds are best, and how that kind of frame, that's who we should be. Involves us to think kind of on ourselves. I do always love to tell people to be a bit more reflexive. It's the most annoying thing for people to listen to because there's no tangibility about it, but almost think about, where are the beliefs that I have, where have they come from, where have I learned about things from? Am I okay maybe calling myself out sometimes? But kind of, it's not about necessarily being up to date on everything. It's just kind of reflecting on where your knowledge base has come from and how you think about what you believe a bit. This involves kind of working towards a paradigm shift, and this involves valuing all body minds, so all neurodivergent people, not just neurodiversity light, which is effectively certain types of people are quite valuable, and if we can contribute to capitalism, we're all good. It's about kind of understanding that everybody inherently is valuable, echoing Imago Dei, and also seeing autistic as being value neutral. So for me, I'm quite happy being autistic, but also sometimes I really don't like being autistic. Certainly when I'm kind of having to kind of do things like chase up the council because there's 2 trolleys in the car park and I can't really use the phone very well. I really hate being autistic then, because it would be much easier if I could just ring up the council and not have a panic attack and have to really get stressed about how I process things. But also being autistic brings great strengths as well. So seeing it as a great value neutral, it's just who you are. It's part of who we are. Yes, autistic people have difficulties and challenges, but we also have great strengths and, in kind of Christian language, gifts that we can give to the church. We can look to spaces that are actually doing this really well. There are some spaces that exist. I've just given one example. There are lots of examples of people who are doing this particularly well. The one I've selected links to the quote that I had at the end of my thesis. So St Martin's in the Fields have a disability and church conference every year, disabled and neurodivergent led, disabled and neurodivergent centred knowledge, and access essential to action. And I ended my thesis on this quote by Fiona Macmillan, who was tweet quoted by Reverend Dr. Susanna Verdon York. So like in a forest, things that struggle to go in the middle thrive on the edge. So Fiona's argument there is that actually some of us are quite happy sat on the edge because it's more comfortable for us, it's more accessible. We still want to be a part of the church, but don't fix us to bring us into the main church. And that very much echoes the feedback loops that I was showing you earlier, especially where perhaps distance from kind of being in a space that's a bit more accepting, further away perhaps from some norms in some big groups, might have less barriers to belonging, some people. And the other thing I would say is not placing being autistic in a silo. People are, as I said, people aren't just autistic. We have lots of identities. We have lots of things going on, like everybody. And Alex, one of my participants, spoke about this in particular in regards to their experience within churches. And they said that there aren't necessarily the same roles, where perhaps women in some spaces might have a different social role to men within the church. They were saying actually that perhaps there aren't those roles for autistic people in church as well. And that made them really reflect on actually maybe there should be those roles for autistic people in churches. And I guess this kind of made me consider some points that autistic people are not just autistic. We have lots of things going on, lots of identities, interests, and different support needs. How can we create spaces that value and celebrate autistic ways of being? And how can we create spaces that value and celebrate all forms of lived experience, all of the identities and all of the things, interests, support needs, jobs? You know, how can we all be part of that church? And I guess to end, this kind of sums up kind of everything. So what we do and how we do religion. So when I talk about do religion, it's basically how we behave, what we expect, all those sort of things, what traditions and rituals we have, what we value. Those can set the boundaries for who is included and excluded, whether we realise it or not. There's some related papers of mine to follow up on. They'll be up on the recording if you want to follow up. And Fudge says hello. Fudge is my sister's cat. She is a tortoiseshell that is very grumpy and otherwise unimpressed at life. References are on request. Thank you to the Tizard Centre Studentship for funding the research. Fudge says hello, and I believe that kind of segues on to our 2 minutes to type in some questions. If I can finish, stop sharing my screen. Super duper. There we go.
Thank you so much, Krysia. That was such an insightful presentation and really looking forward to hearing people's questions. So after a short break, we'll have a Q&A session. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, you can ask questions by typing them into the chat box on your screen. This part of the webinar will also be recorded, so we try not to read out the names of people asking questions. However, if you want to make doubly sure that you're not identified by name, look for the small checkbox which offers you the option to ask your question anonymously. We often don't get through all the questions, so if you see a question that interests you, you can upvote it by clicking the thumbs up sign, and that will help us to prioritise what we get through. So we'll take a short break now and we'll begin again in 3 minutes. Great, we're now back and I'll share some of the questions that people have asked and invite Krysia to respond to them. As I mentioned, we might not get through every question, but if you send us an email after the webinar, we can forward it on to Krysia and they might be able to reply to you. So Krysia, the first question is what practical changes could churches make to make their services more easily accessible to autistic people?
That's a really good question, because although obviously at the end I talked about the really big picture things, there's actually a lot of really quick fixes as well. I guess practically one thing is actually to be aware that autistic people have different needs. So that's kind of awareness and kind of learning about autism from autistic people is always a really good place to start. Having maybe a space where people can move to in the service, and actually sometimes, I mean, I have some on my desk, so if I can fix them up. I always have things like this, so if people, rather than me sitting there peeling the skin off my fingers, which I used to all the time, I now fiddle with something like this, or I put something on my lap. So that then people, because autistic people can process the world quite differently, so quite a few of us kind of use our hands and stim, or obviously when we think more kind of stereotypical ideas of what autistic people are like, people may kind of have things like rocking and putting hands on ears, but actually that's all about kind of regulating and sensory regulating. So providing those kind of opportunities and spaces is a really quick win. I got a box very recently, actually, it's under there under a load of paper, so I can't show you. Big box of toys that I took up to a conference that I ran for 10 quid from the works. So it's actually quite easy. You can get them on Amazon as well. Things maybe around things like people in the if you have a welcome team, making sure people kind of have badges or stickers so you know who they are. Because one of the things I used to find most anxiety provoking is not knowing who to approach, or not knowing kind of who is doing what. And I think kind of having people identify themselves is always really useful. It can be something like a lanyard, it can be a badge, whatever works for your church. Different people have different preferences. It could be brightly coloured. You might want to use the neurodiversity rainbow colours. You might want to use maybe a colour of your preference, or if you know you have an autistic person, kind of child or adult in your audience, you could always talk to them actually about, you know, how are you finding church? That's another good thing to do. Because I find that actually dialogue, again, is a really easy, quick win. Rather than looking at all these big systemic changes, how can we promote really good relationships where people feel that actually they trust you and they feel safe to say, actually, I really like this bit of the service. So, for example, some people in more liturgy-based scenarios may really like the order of liturgy and knowing what's coming up, or people may like perhaps being able, in a more charismatic church, may be able to like to wave their arms around, but other things might be a bit more challenging. So having those conversations and that dialogue, I just think is so important. So I think focusing on quick wins is a really good place to start, rather than looking at, oh my goodness, Chris has just gone and said all this really difficult stuff. Actually, a lot of the things actually that kind of echo what other people have said in research already, and other practitioners have said. There's a lot that people can kind of quick win do.
Yeah, thanks, Krysia. That's really helpful advice. The next question is where people where people experienced in sorry, where people experienced exclusion, was it more social or actually the rituals of the service itself that was exclusionary?
That's a really good question. A lot of people, it was quite social. So a lot of it was around people, about social interactions, um, people not feeling like they have friends, not feeling like they had a crew. That was one thing Thomas said. He said he didn't have a crew of people. Although he kind of knew people at the mosque and spoke to them, didn't have a crew. There was also some of it was very sensory based as well. So two of my participants found kind of in building services quite difficult, but they really enjoyed celebrations at their local park that their mosque did. And I certainly know of churches that have done open air services and things like that, where they've said actually where it's open air, the noise doesn't bounce around from the ceiling and my anxiety is massively decreased. So I think a lot of it was kind of social in terms of interacting with other people, double empathy problem style stuff. and some type of sensory environment, which I know Leon and Katie have done a lot of work on as being challenging for some people.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Thanks, Krisha. And then the next person, they've sent 3 questions, so I'll just ask one at a
Okay,
time, so you don't need to hold that all in your head. But they've said, "Hi, I researched the inclusion of autistic adults in Hungarian Christian communities. So good to hear you speak. I've referenced your work in my master's thesis."
thank you.
Um, so their questions are, firstly, where do the inclusive policies originate for or initiated by?
I think it very much depends on church and denomination. Certainly, different denominations do different things, and that will also differ per location that that church is in as well. So my background is more with Baptist and Methodist churches. They're very generally independent. They set their own thing. But I also know from being involved in the Neurodiversity Working Group for the Church of England, there are some things that are also more central that's filtered down. But again, it's generally down to individual churches deciding if they want to follow things or not. And I guess there's also this thing where denominations don't necessarily always talk to each other. So I know our Mehmet's done some fantastic guidelines. They are fantastic. I don't need to go and reinvent the wheel. Just read Anne's work. But because they've got a Church of England banner sticker on it, a lot of churches that I spoke to in research before I did my PhD actually hadn't heard of it because it wasn't filtered down through their system. So I think there's a lot of siloing that goes on in regards to policy and people thinking they need to kind of do things themselves.
Yeah, and following on from that, they've asked what motivates the inclusivity in some churches and what can be done in others to motivate inclusion and accessibility.
Again, these are really good questions. I guess for some churches, it's the fact that they have lived experience within their congregation or within their group. Certainly within the literature review I did, it's when people were faced with actually different lived experiences and they wanted to value that person as part of their congregation, that actually there were then changes and discussions. I think one of the things I kind of say in the kind of the end of my work is that perhaps having we don't need maybe one set way for all churches to be, because there's different theologies, there's different cultures within the groups. If you kind of think of Geertz's work on culture within religious groups, they will have their own culture, but we can maybe adopt practices more widely that kind of can embed and then offer that choice to people who have, when people have beliefs a certain way, or people don't have that choice of where they go, rather than being like, well, the only church that isn't going to give me sensory overload is that one, and it's denominationally very different, and I don't know how they do the worship, and I don't know how they do the liturgy, or I don't know how they do stuff. So it's almost around that choice as well.
Okay, and finally, have you noticed have you noticed different policies by denomination and the reasons for the difference in accessibility?
I think as kind of policy goes, I think some of the main core stuff is quite the same, but I think there's differences where people come from theologically and where people pitch people. Um, and I think that neurodivergence is very much a buzzword in the UK, and I think it's becoming so globally from having been involved with 2 books I'm part of co-editing. We've had some fantastic stuff from the States, from Canada, Africa, quite a few other places. Um, but I think in regards to policy, could you repeat the question? Sorry.
No, of course, that's fine. Have you noticed different policies by denomination and reasons for the difference in accessibility?
I think we're still at the point from my knowledge, of creating those policies to be able to see if there's any difference. I think my understanding is a lot of the difference people understand what it means to be autistic differs, and people have sometimes a different theological basis on what they might prop it up on and what they might base it on, as well as knowledge of whether they've worked with autistic people, have autistic people in their family, whether they are autistic, have friends or family who are autistic. So there's lots of different other factors as well. And I think they would all reflect into what might be done. So if you're perhaps having a church that perhaps wants to do something, has not spoken to an autistic person, not engaged with catastone, you might have something quite different come out to perhaps people who've worked alongside autistic people, and no kind of broader valuing of everybody and really kind of or consistent relationships and dialogue thing. But again, different churches need different things, and different policies might reflect what different churches need, or kind of guidance on what different churches need.
Yeah, wonderful. Moving on to the next person's question. Someone's asking, can you share how this research is impacting the COV Church of England neurodiversity workforce? I didn't know there was one.
So in regards to the working group, some of the work that I have published, particularly alongside Krysia Sango, who is the Principal Lecturer in Public Health at London Met. She's done lots of work around spirituality, people with learning disabilities. We are collating together some resources, so it's going into there. And there's also some training going on within London Diocese, which some of the work has been slid into as well. And I think there's other work more broadly that we're looking to do, which it will shape. And obviously, I'm not the only researcher on board. I think it's quite important for me to say that. So there's quite a few people's practice-based knowledge we're pulling on. There's other people's PhD research or master's research, and there's other really valuable lived experience. So there's lots of different ways it's kind of pulling in, but they're probably the two most tangible ways. The 90,000 word document that I wrote, finished last year, is being signaled in. And I guess it would be really good for it to impact more broadly, because obviously, as I said, I'm not from a CV. I understand CV churches, been to them multiple times, but in terms of my actual kind of background, I come from a Baptist and Methodist background, so it would be really good to have ways into kind of more in ecumenical discussions, which I think is really important.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And the next person has asked, the narrative seems to hold, the narrative seems to hold similarly across religious groups. Do you think this is true beyond the two groups you looked at, or is there literature on this?
Oh, good question. A lot of the literature around disability is very American and very Christian. So when I was doing my literature review, it was actually really interesting what was coming out. Because obviously, where I did my PhD over 6 years, there was obviously the work that Kat were doing was coming out and massively impacting kind of the shape and direction of what I was doing, especially attending the research groups. And I think there is a lot less that is not looking at Christianity. I think that some of this is because of some of the funding priorities across different countries. I think certainly in the States, where religion is quite grounded within the culture of what goes on over there, things do get funded. Obviously, there's still competition, but certainly it's quite a different landscape over here, especially in regards to disability and religion and neurodivergence. I also think that where historically the UK has been a Christian country, it's kind of in kinds of when we look at attendance and when we look at how people identify in the census as well, that's probably also going to shape what's going on, and also how the church has, as an institution, has shaped what's gone on in society. So there is comparatively less on other religions. My work, the work that I did, was one of the first to look at to quite the way it did. I originally planned to look at more groups, but COVID got in the way of my recruitment plans. So I think that's really important to note that actually there is real scope to explore different groups and narratives and theologies. So although it holds for two Abrahamic religions, it would be really interesting to know perhaps for Hinduism or Sikhism, or actually also people who perhaps left churches as well, or left religion full stop. That would be really interesting. But I had a couple of participants who had left church and did identify as atheists. There's obviously it's still kind of, there still needs to be more unpacking around that as well. And I think what I find particularly interesting was how similar I wasn't expecting the experiences to be so similar across the two. because obviously attendance, you have what a friend of mine used to call the holy hour in churches. You have half 10 to 11 o'clock on a Sunday, bums on seats in churches, whereas obviously mosques operate slightly differently, where attendance kind of is shaped by more festivals for some people, and you have kind of more segregated areas of people, the mosque that people can go to, although the limitation of that with a church is you've sat in my pew, which I always find quite funny if you've sat in someone else's pew and it hasn't got their name on. So I think I was quite surprised that there were these similarities, and I think there should be more digging and exploring because, as I said at the beginning, autistic people are from all backgrounds. There's going to be autistic people in all cultural groups, all kind of religious groups, and all places. It's just that at the moment we've got some fab work on churches, and that's great. It'd be really great to see if the other experiences match, or if they don't match, and what way they don't match. You know, because obviously there's different social demands and different sensory experiences within different ways we do religion and different religious groups.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and it would be amazing to see more research done about that. I'm going to move forward some of the popped up questions, but we've got plenty of time, so if I've skipped your question, I will most likely get back to it. So this person's asked, if excluded, how can someone approach the situation? Do you have any advice on how to approach leadership rather than change churches?
I think for me, the one thing that shaped some of the answers I got in the group conversations was about the importance of leadership being on board for any change. So, and I think, and that came up across Christian and Muslim groups, the fact that the leadership of your church or mosque generally shapes how things are done, what the expectations are, and the culture of the space. Could you repeat the question? Because I've just forgotten again.
Yeah, absolutely. If excluded, how can someone approach the situation? Do
Yeah.
you have any advice for how to approach leadership rather than change churches?
Yes, I think I wasn't overly successful with approaching leadership, but I think that says more about the leadership of the church I was in rather than the tactics I took. Because there were other people that did the same thing. I didn't just go in all guns blazing. I think dialogue and communicate, as like I said at the beginning, kind of your quick wins, dialogue and communication can be a really good tool. And having those one-to-one conversations, because certainly I did find, although I was excluded, there was one deacon who was particularly supportive and kind of got stuff and included me in a lot of stuff, and what we did quite a few work on quite a few workshops for the circuit, and we did radio together as well. And I think for me, working with Prue kind of helped me pursue what I do now. And I think it's just almost that kind of, if you can find the right people, basically finding the right person, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I'm kind of meandering all over the place. If someone doesn't get it, perhaps they're not your people. Perhaps it's time to find different people. It doesn't mean don't go to church. It's maybe perhaps having a look at what there is out there and finding people who get and can be on your side and in your corner. Because I found having someone in your corner instrumental to helping my self-advocacy and also the research that I do now.
Fab. And I wonder if I can just ask a wee follow-up on that as well.
Yeah.
You mentioned like finding the right people. I wonder if you could give suggestions on like what the right things to say are, maybe if people aren't sure how to initiate those conversations, even if they do find the right people.
I guess it's good to kind of do different sides to it. And I guess if you're being approached, it's really important to validate that person's lived experience. And I think we do a really good job at trying to do this in churches, and churches can do this really well. But kind of goes back to Damien Milton's double empathy problem. For those of you that don't know, it's basically a mutual mismatch in understanding and communication between autistic people and non-autistic people, and that sometimes we as autistic people experience things that non-autistic people haven't got a clue about because they've never experienced them, and vice versa. And I think almost a way to, I don't think it can be fully bridged, but I do think we can work towards breaking down some of that mismatch in communication and those kind of, when we kind of got crossed wires. And one way is almost, if you're the person being approached, to kind of listen and validate. And again, it goes back to some of the stuff I said about reflexivity, where you're looking to maybe challenge some of the, if you're feeling, but what on earth are they on about? You know, thinking, okay, so why do I think that? And using everything as kind of a way to learn. And I guess if you're almost that's the approachee, and the approacher almost having that confidence, having perhaps what you might want to say kind of quite tangibly with you. So you might want to take either some notes or kind of something to help guide you, to help you be really basically be able to advocate for yourself. When I went to leadership, I think this did help. I did take my mum. So sometimes taking someone who can support you if you have access to that. Again, I know that's a privilege. Not everyone might have access to either a friend or a family member, but my mum's quite good at talking. Before, I was quite good at talking, and she's quite good at being quite managerial. So she was able to kind of assist and support, and sometimes that can be a way in as well, to kind of have those, again, it's those people in your corner and starting small.
Fab, thank you, Krysia. The next question is someone saying, thank you, Krysia, for a really interesting presentation. I would also like to thank you for being willing to share your experience as an autistic person growing up on the CAT podcast. As it was listening to one of those episodes that led me to my own autism diagnosis.
Oh,
yeah. My question, do you have any thoughts on how the problem of normativity can be overcome? Thank you.
again, good question, big question, but a good one. I think the thing around normativity is the groups I've been in where there is dialogue, compassion, and people working together to unpick things. That's generally where we're very good at what I would call cripping the space. So cripping is a very disability studies term of kind of undoing some of those normative expectations on how we might be in a space, and kind of doing things with disabled lived experience at the centre. And I think that is a really good work, but I think people do it without realising it's cripping, because again, I'm aware that some of the lexicon within disability studies is a reclaiming of language, and some people might see the word crip as less positive. But I do think that there's kind of, when we can actively decide to centre what we need rather than do stuff for the sake of doing stuff, that's quite helpful. I think churches historically were quite practical anyway. I mean, people used to make people's houses and basements and all sorts of things. So I also wonder kind of how we do church, and kind of how much of what we do is what we need to do sometimes, and how much is stuff that's tradition that we've kind of carried on because someone thought it was a good idea 60 years ago to have a certain cushion on a certain bench at a certain time. So kind of reflecting and kind of unpicking and being okay to kind of just accept everybody. And again, I think education is another part of that. It's not just about learning about what it means to be autistic. I know that certainly ADHD people could experience kind of difficulties in church, especially if there's really long liturgies. I've known people to really struggle with that. Lots of written text. I mean, I have visual stress. Zoe, you're dyslexic, you know this. So I guess there's lots of different ways in which we can kind of learn about other people's experiences that can help boot normativity as well. And I guess also just valuing everybody's contribution. I think churches sometimes we're quite good at doing that. Sometimes we're not so good at doing that. And I think if we're not so good at doing that, it's usually not intentional. But I think kind of valuing what people can give is quite useful in terms of, okay, so that person, they're really good at approaching people and talking, or that person looks like they might be really good on the sound deck, or they might be really good at chatting to people in a welcome position, or maybe they'd be really good at helping us stage time because we're not very good at that. So there's lots of kind of different things kind of wrapped up in that. And I guess also that there's lots of things that, and this is kind of one of my bugbears, is that there's lots of things that other disciplines know about this sort of stuff that hasn't necessarily transferred fully into kind of our knowledge of how we do church and how we do mosque and how we create inclusive spaces more broadly. And I think this is why I'm co-editing to the books I am with Dr. Nathan Keats, was our interest in kind of how things kind of map across different disciplines. And I think looking at other things about what maybe schools, cinemas, other places can do sometimes can be really helpful as well. Because then you can think, oh, is that a really good idea? Would that help me create a space that centers the people who are here rather than what I should be doing? Kind of should, in inverted commas, as in some idea from out of pie space rather than kind of centering on the people and the lived experiences who are in the room.
Thanks, Grisha. The next question is, there's a considerable overlap between autism and queerness. Did that come up as a factor in your conversations at all?
Absolutely, yes. One of the things I did find was quite a few of my autistic participants were queer. And particularly in relation to the quote I showed from Alex towards the end, they were saying that it's not just kind of autistic people that don't have these spaces and roles. Actually, it's a very intersectional thing. And what I did find looking at some of the literature was obviously that they're not the same thing, but they have similar social dynamics knocking around, and that was compounded for autistic people who were queer.
Yeah, interesting. And the next question we've got is, thank you for such an sorry. Thank you for such an interesting presentation. Krysia, you mentioned Thomas seeing his religion as his master identity and that he saw his autism through this. Could you talk a little bit more about what it looks like for folk to see their autism through their faith and how that's different to not seeing one's autism through faith?
Good question. I guess for Thomas, everything made sense through the worldview and the beliefs he had. And I think there's different degrees of ways we can do this. Because obviously your autistic identity can still be really important and your faith can still be really important, much in the same way that you could be really proud of being autistic and still be really kind of into swimming or into, Pokemon Go. I mean, the amount of Pokemon Go meetups I go to, it's like my ADAR is going ding, 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 ding all the time. But I think there's kind of that coexistence. So although you can see things through the lens of, so for him, he was understanding things like jinn through the lens of a very Muslim theology. I think he was also seeing, for him, being autistic wasn't a bad thing. It wasn't a deficit. It wasn't something to be ashamed of. So it's almost that coexistence and understanding of the strengths that people can give, and maybe some of the theological understandings about where being autistic might come from theologically, that are value neutral to a certain extent.
Thank you so much, Krysia. That's all the questions we have. So we will bring it to a close there. Thank you so much, Krysia, for coming and sharing on such an interesting topic and for generating a really interesting Q&A session there. Thank you to everyone who joined us live today and to those of you watching this back on YouTube. If you enjoyed this webinar, do take time to look at the Centre for Autism and Theology website to find out what's coming up in our programme of events. And if you wish to join our mailing list, you can do so by scanning the QR code that will come up on the screen at the very end of this webinar. We're also so excited to announce that instead of just a 1-hour webinar in October, the Centre is organising a 3-day online conference in November. The conference title is Faith on the Margins, Engaging with Non-Speaking and Black Autistic Christians. It will take place on the 5th to the 7th of November. Each day of the conference will be around a specific topic. Day 1 focusing on autism and spirituality, Day 2 on autism and communication, especially on non or minimally speaking autistic people, and Day 3 on autism and ethnically minoritized communities, especially Black autistic people and their faith communities. The conference is part of a project by two of our researchers. One of each of the 3 days, they will present their results on their research, and each day will include input from practitioners and scholars. More details will follow soon, so keep an eye out on our social media, and if you would like to join our mailing list, more information will be shared to our subscribers. But for now, you can save the date. Thank you so much for joining us, and we wish you a peaceful rest to your day.